We are now joined by the chief football writer with The Independent, Miguel Delaney. Miguel, how are you getting on?
Not too bad, thanks.
Last night, you're at Old Trafford. One of the more dysfunctional Liverpool performances, particularly in midfield. They had issues in the middle of the park all night, and a limp enough defeat for them in the end against a Manchester United team who looked pretty re-energised even, compared to how they'd played in the first two games of the season.
Yeah, how quickly things change. The baton of crisis passes to Liverpool. I suppose... Sorry, I'll turn that off. I suppose... it's a bit much to call it a crisis yet, but at the very least, there are a lot of issues for Klopp to solve. And it's interesting, I suppose, given the recent history of the two clubs, how what so stood out about United was their energy and aggression and intensity, which was everything that Liverpool were lacking. And Klopp said after the game they had control for most of it, which is probably true, but it was kind of I think as Wenger might say, a sterile control, in that it never looked like they were really going to push United through. And he said afterwards he thought an equaliser wouldn't have been a surprise. I think most people in the stadium, and even those not Manchester United fans, would have disagreed with that, because United felt relatively comfortable, which is remarkable given the situation they were in last week. I mean, as regards United themselves, it was a very impressive performance. I do wonder, without getting ahead of ourselves saying that they're completely out of the woods, I do wonder how much of it is circumstantial. Obviously, because it's Liverpool, there's always going to be an emotional response. And it was one of those games where you could really tell, like, they were relishing every challenge in a way they weren't against Brentford, purely because they had a point to prove. I think that was especially true of players like Diego Dalot, Bruno Fernandes, Alessandro Martinez was absolutely loving it from the start. But another element to that as well, I suppose, is one of the big things that was noticeable with both Brentford and Brighton. It's remarkable to say this, given Liverpool over the last few years, but they were pressing United in a way that Liverpool couldn't really, and partly because of that midfield you talk about. And it meant that United were able to play through each time. It also meant that De Gea could frequently knock it long, whereas against both Brentford and Brighton, he was forced to play it short a lot more. So it makes this weekend, although, I mean, that's one thing about the start of the Premier League season. It's actually been breakneck from the very start. And as soon as one weekend's massive storylines are done, you're straight on to the next one, because it all feeds into it. Suddenly, we're keen to see whether Manchester United can prove it was the real deal by beating Southampton, which is a remarkable statement in itself. And also, Liverpool, suddenly the pressure grows to get that first win.
Yeah, and the pressure grows particularly on Liverpool at this stage as well, Miguel, because if you look at the way that Man City have accumulated points over the last 6-7 seasons, particularly under Pep Guardiola, like, to have dropped 7 points this early in the season with the start that Liverpool had, particularly where they would have expected to win against Fulham and Crystal Palace, it's not crisis point at all after 3 games, but still, giving up 7 points when generally you can't afford to give too many away with the way the title races have been in recent seasons, this stuttering start gives them not a whole lot of margin for error for even the rest of the season.
Yeah, that's it. Now, the one caveat, I suppose, to that is that it mightn't be as pressurised this season because we have the great unknown of the World Cup on the horizon, and that could play havoc with everything, no matter how far anyone's ahead, even City. In fact, that's one area where City's actual strengths could become a potential weakness, because they're so good, they'll have so many starters in the World Cup, that the starters in the World Cup could well find themselves fatigued by January, February, and that could cause an opening in the title race. So from that perspective, I don't think falling behind is necessarily as much of an issue as it would be in previous seasons, but certainly it's not ideal, and Liverpool need to get players back and need to get points back on the table.
Well, Liverpool fans have been crying out all summer about a lack of reinforcement in midfield. And in some ways we saw that coming back to haunt last night, because generally they weren't able to press in the same way because they had Milner and Henderson in midfield. And again, I don't think Liverpool would have wanted Milner to be in some of the attacking positions he was in the first half of last night, when they did have a lot of possession at different times, but very rarely was it someone breaking from midfield into a good position in the box. It was a very on-Liverpool-like performance in their midfield, and a lot of that has to go down to the personnel that were deployed. I know some of that is down to injury, but if you're playing Henderson and if you're playing Milner, you're not going to get the same dynamism you would with some of the other midfield options they have.
Yeah, it was one of those games. I mean, Henderson has looked past his best for some time, although still obviously a very, very useful option. Milner, I mean, I suppose he's so far. I mean, this is inevitable given his age. He's so far past his best, he can't really see it anymore, which is a bit harsh. But I mean, I think at this point, Milner remains a useful squad option, someone to fill in, but not someone you want to be putting in midfield at this stage of his career. But that also makes it all the more surprising then, because I think the one Liverpool midfielder available who you could say is in his prime, which is Fabinho, was left on the bench. Now, one of the rationales there was apparently that Klopp's been worried about how he's been getting caught on the counter in recent games. But even then, just compared to what they had, it was just so pedestrian. And as you say, Milner was popping up in all sorts of positions. It was quite odd from that perspective as well. Now, it was as if Milner had the kind of roaming role. And while he's still obviously immensely physically fit for his age, that doesn't necessarily translate into prime kind of effectiveness in that midfield position, because there was oftentimes when he was on the ball and not actually doing that much with it. It certainly wasn't the Liverpool midfield as we've come to associate them. It is a concern. Again, it has to be put into the context of so many absences. But even that, because it's not just about the midfield with Liverpool. I think one of the biggest issues for me over the last 3 games, it does feel as if people have or opposition sides figured out how to play against Liverpool's wing backs, who've pretty much been kind of, I don't know, you might call them the afterburners of the side for the past 5 years. Whereas, I mean, when the 2 wing backs start flying forward, it just makes Liverpool a completely different proposition. Yet they've been subdued in that way.
First 25 minutes, Miguel, particularly for Trent Alexander-Arnold over on that side, where clearly Elanga was deployed out there to run and to try and occupy Trent. He had a miserable period, particularly up to the point when he got booked, which was 25 minutes into the game. He had real problems over on that side. Now, second half, when Liverpool had a bit more of the ball, he got forward a bit more. But the first half hour, 25 minutes, was really hard going for him.
Well, I mean, over the last 2-3 years, one of the big debates in football, particularly around the England national team, has been whether Alexander-Arnold is actually a good defender, with Klopp, of course, addressing this himself. That's remained open to question. But this season, it feels like everyone's putting it to the ultimate test by really targeting him. United repeatedly went for it last night, and Alexander-Arnold always looked on the edge. And the thing about that is, once he's forced into that position, it means you're not getting the best out of him. You're not getting which are his attacking talents. So suddenly it's a dilemma. For whatever about all his personnel issues, I think which everyone would accept means this can't be put into the kind of extreme criticism that you'd usually say in these situations. But it does give Klopp problems to solve. It's something to figure out now.
Yeah, well, with Liverpool, I think they've always traded off those defensive liabilities within his game for what he can offer up at the other end of the field. And he did put in some good crosses in the second half. I can understand where Southgate's coming from, though, where Reece James possibly feels more of a complete wing-back. And even before the emergence of Reece James, he always had a kind of tendency to go for Kieran Trippier or for Kyle Walker because of their positioning, because of their recovery pace, as opposed to playing Trent Alexander-Arnold. Even when Walker tucked in as one of the 3 centre-backs, he never seemed to fancy Trent within the England system.
Well, I mean, that ultimately comes down to, I suppose, just a different interpretation of what a fullback is. I think Southgate would have a very traditional interpretation, which is a fullback is, first of all, there to defend, even allowing for the attacking dimension of the modern game. Whereas Klopp, I mean, I'm not sure you can even really call them fullbacks. They're really wing-backs. I remember talking to a Premier League coach 2 years ago about how Liverpool play. And I said, well, one of the great difficulties of playing Liverpool was basically, when they're at their absolute peak, was that basically what happens when they're at their best in that regard is the 2 number 8s, who at that point I suppose would have been Fabinho and Henderson, and the 2 wing-backs basically form this line really high up the pitch that pens you in. Whereas now that's completely broken, basically.
Maguire, another England defender and Manchester United's captain. A ballsy move in some ways by Eric Ten Hag to decide 3 games in, I'm going to bench this guy and he's going to sit on the bench entirely for a game against Liverpool. But is it a case now where Lissandro and Varane probably are first choice centre-backs and Maguire might not see a lot of game time from here?
It feels like that's going to be the case. Of course, Ten Hag was diplomatic after the game, saying that Maguire and Ronaldo will play a role in the short future. That I assume he went in the short term. But it's difficult not to see the direction of travel here, especially given how cumbersome Maguire's looked on the ball. And this is going to be a ball-playing team. Martinez is good in it. Varane's even better on it. And even Martinez seemed so much more suited to having Varane beside him. Now, Martinez, I think there's a bit of an irony there, and this comes back to what we're saying about how maybe some of this win was circumstantial for United. But in a weird way, Martinez's bigger challenges aren't going to come in the big games, because of the tactical nature of those games where they're more open. It will suit him more. The more difficult ones, maybe when he's going to get balls launched at him by some of the lesser sides, exactly as Brighton and Brentford did. But for the moment, it offered promise last night. Although we could well see more changes there, because I reported earlier today that Manchester United are actually considering a ball-playing goalkeeper. Now, this was, of course, the issue that Pep Guardiola had 6 years ago with Joe Hart, Bravo, and then until he eventually got Ederson, because it is the foundation pillar of any sort of team like this. They need a goalkeeper that can properly play at the back. Last night it suited United to launch it long, but for the way Ten Hag plays, that's kind of unsustainable. So I think it's good. There's still a fair bit of uncertainty there. But yeah, I think you're right. I think we'll probably see Martinez and Varane being the partnership going forward.
Yeah, you've been reporting around Kevin Trapp, and almost the assumption, I think many would have felt that Trapp will be coming in as a backup to David De Gea, which is an issue United have right now since Henderson has gone back out. But you feel that potentially they could be trying to sign Trapp as a first choice goalkeeper as opposed to De Gea's backup then? I
mean, this is me speculating. If they get one of the two goalkeepers, I would imagine it's going to be one of those situations where, almost a little bit like actually when Karius first went in at Liverpool, not to say they're the same, but where they for the first month or so, it'll be kind of putting them in, easing them in, maybe they're using them in kind of League Cup games, something like that, until eventually, maybe after a month or two, Ten Hag has to make a decision.
Interesting. I mean, again, we saw with David De Gea, the graphic went up on Sky Sports, I think about an hour into the game, and you've already mentioned the fact that not one of his kickouts went short. There was a feeling that maybe earlier in the season the ball would be rolled to Maguire, it would start from the back and they would work their way out. Pretty much De Gea went longer than 30, 40 yards with every single kick out last night. It was a very different approach to what they'd done up until this point.
Well, I suppose, I mean, the second goal for Brentford, should I say, was, I suppose, the big signal about the danger of that, because it remains remarkable at the moment of the season for me, and to see a Manchester United team like that. And I suppose that's testament to the response last night, because they looked so fearful and hesitant when De Gea tried to pass it out for that goal. And obviously they've had to write it off. But yeah, that's not sustainable in the medium term or even the short term.
Cristiano, I wonder what the role becomes now. As you say, Tannock mentioned after the game that he's still part of their short-term future. We'll see how short-term that's going to be. Cristiano got to come on for a bit of a cameo, but generally Rashford's movement was good. Could perhaps have had a second goal when he went past Gomez early in the second half. He created plenty of opportunities when he was dribbling at that Liverpool defence at times. Elanga, before he came off, was getting plenty of joy over on the left-hand side. It's been commented many times that it seems that Bruno Fernandes prefers to have players who move a bit more in front of him. Where does Cristiano now fit in, or does he even still fit in?
I think for all the public diplomacy, and even though the Glazer hierarchy would prefer Ronaldo to stay because of his commercial value, I think at this point, most people are realising, not least Ronaldo himself, it would be better if he moved. I think just having a figure like that as a sub, it doesn't usually work. And even then, I mean, he was quite instructive last night in terms of how Ten Hag used Ronaldo, because at that point of the game, United actually needed someone to hold the ball up, someone to do a team role, something selfless. Ronaldo got the ball and try kind of speculative long shots, looking for his glory moment. And again, I mean, it didn't harm United by the end, but it was a potential risk there when they needed basically better team play.
Yeah, he puts the ball in the Stretford end at one point when United are on the counter-attack. I think the game had just gone into injury time. The sensible option was to hold it up, get it back to one of the midfielders and keep possession for a few minutes. But instead, as you said, Cristiano Ronaldo decides to have a shot from an almost impossible angle. United are probably going to change shape maybe a little bit with Casemiro coming in as well. Fred was one of the players who was dropped from last weekend, but Fred and Casemiro currently play as a double pivot together with Brazil, so they are an option to play together. Maybe it's McTominay who drops out, maybe it's Fred who drops out. But Christian Eriksen's role I thought was quite interesting, because a lot of his best work is done a little bit further up the field, but he's been playing a little bit further back to help out the system as he did last night. Do we expect that Eriksen plays a little bit deeper when Casemiro comes into the team, or how do you see this midfield looking now when they've got Casemiro now?
I think much depends on how Casemiro adapts. So I think Eriksen's been put back there because he's one of the few really kind of technically adept midfielders that Manchester United have, because they need that sort of control further back. Casemiro offers more. But again, I mean, I think it should be stressed. There's absolutely no doubt about Casemiro's quality. He's one of the best defensive midfielders, has been one of the best defensive midfielders in the world for over half a decade now. But that's been in a situation where he's had Toni Kroos and Luka Modric in front of him, two of the best passers of the modern game. So there's going to require some adaptation there, which means unless basically something fits together for Ten Hag straight away, we might see a little bit of experimentation over the next few games there. But and again, experimentation in a fairly risky situation, because United can't afford too much experimentation.
Yeah, and look, there's a lack of progressive passers at the club at Manchester right now. It's no coincidence they were looking at Frankie de Jong and Adrien Rabiot to come into the team, and then they go to Casemiro, who's a totally different profile. They don't really have too many players to progress the ball all that well. Like, even when Real Madrid were buying the players in that are going to effectively become Casemiro's replacements, even though that wasn't the intention, in Tchouaméni and in Camavinga, they're passers who can bring the ball a bit more forward, and they've always had Valverde or Kroos or Modric around. Like, United might still be looking for a midfielder in the coming week to actually get someone to slot in there, because I'm not sure if Fred or McTominay are the right passer to have in beside Casemiro.
Well, even this morning, I mean, it's interesting. Like last week, I was told any prospect of De Jong is completely off, 100% off. Whereas this morning, suddenly the two rumblings, it's 98% off. There's still some allowance, because there is a little bit of uncertainty about what's going to happen to him with Barcelona. I mean, I'd be very surprised if De Jong did end up at Manchester United at this point. But in this market, in this window, should I say, who knows? There's still a little bit of interest there. From that perspective, though, it's clear that the Glazers have actually decided to up the budget now, because I remember being told a few weeks ago that the Young budget was basically it, and Casemiro you would have expected to cover a lot of that. Whereas it seems from the start of the season they are willing to go much higher, given there's also this interest in Anthony from Ajax as well.
Yeah, the Anthony one last night kind of sparked up a little bit again by his agent, and then his agent deleted an Instagram story which he had up, which was himself and Anthony watching the Man United-Liverpool game and looking like they were almost celebrating the United result, and he deleted the first one, which was them watching it on the TV. But because Anthony has now stepped out of training at Ajax, because the clubs have been in talks most of the summer, it seems that's one that could well happen.
Well, as someone put it to me today, when it gets to that situation where someone is kind of training on their own and makes it that clear they want to leave, it's very, very rare they actually stay at their club, just because there's so much potential for difficulty. Now, it doesn't always happen, of course. Some come back into the fold and kind of knuckle down. I suppose that does make Ajax's situation or their position a bit more complicated. But then on the other side, Ajax have no need to sell. They already feel they've moved on enough this summer. But they do have Hakim Ziyech likely coming back, because he's in negotiation with the club from Chelsea. So that may create an opening. But certainly Ajax, they've set their price, and it's up to Manchester United to meet it. Now, and if they do, again, it's another pretty high expenditure. And I mean, Anthony's an interesting one. Like, everyone's seen the clips. There's clearly huge talent there, but it's fairly limited evidence, just because his career has been so brief anymore. And whether you should be spending that much on a young player with that limited experience is a big question in itself. But I mean, I suppose Ten Hag knows him better than anyone. Yeah,
well, especially coming out of the Eredivisie, it's very different to bringing in Casemiro, who is very much a proven entity because of his time at Real Madrid and everything he's achieved at international and club level. It'll be intriguing to see what happens with Manchester United over the rest of the window. I kind of wonder about the Frankie de Jong one, because again, it seems to be a little bit up in the air. I mean, Barcelona still have not been able to register Jules Koundé. We'll see what happens with Aubameyang, which we're going to be talking about in a moment as well. But they're going to need outs before the end of this transfer window. So maybe de Jong might become available purely from that point of view. Manchester United's pursuit has been long, Miguel, when it comes to him this summer. And I have to think there must have been some encouragement for them at some point. I know the narrative seems to be that he keeps on knocking Manchester United away, and why did Manchester United stay interested? Manchester United surely had to get some indication from his camp at some point that he would be open to joining them, or they would have pulled out of this race a long time ago.
Sure, look, I mean, like, he had his breakout season of his career under Ten Hag at Ajax. So, I mean, I don't think people can seriously believe that, I mean, for all it's been made out that De Jong wants to stay at Barcelona, and I do think there's an element there. People can't seriously believe that United are going into this blind, because Ten Hag and De Jong know each other so well. It's just not realistic. They haven't been in contact. So from that perspective, obviously, Ten Hag has been pushing, has been given sufficient encouragement. If he was told an absolute outright no, then I suppose it would have ended much sooner. I mean, someone put this to me about a month ago, that even allowing for all of Manchester United's dysfunction in the market, given Ten Hag knows De Jong so well, not even they would indulge this if there was absolutely no chance.
Well, you were there at Old Trafford last evening, and it's interesting timing from the Glazers to open up the chequebook right at the end of the transfer window at a time when there are large fan protests, and the fan protests outside the ground very considerable last night.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose not as hostile as previous occasions, like when they got a game actually postponed. And also the empty seats didn't transpire, I suppose. But this was, I mean, to give United fans their due, this was a different type of protest. It was a very noisy one. They made themselves heard. As to whether it will have effect, I mean, from what I mean, there is, of course, a bigger topic of discussion here. That's really for another kind of 25-minute conversation. But as to whether the Glazers have officially have the club for sale, that's never the case, really. But from speaking to people in the last week, I did a piece on it last week. There are a lot of consortiums who believe that there's a better chance now than ever to actually buy Manchester United. But the Glazers would want a very high price, which is $6 billion. And while I don't think there's any immediate prospect of a sale, just from what I've been told, I think there could be a sense of grounds being tested here from all parties, and to see how this situation develops. But I mean, even if the Glazers were to decide to sell tomorrow, which they're not going to, it would not be a quick process. So I mean, I think even due diligence and that in a situation where the economic climate isn't so volatile would take 6 months on United. Even that would be longer. But certainly, and I suppose the fan protests feed into this. It does feel there's just there are a few different threads to this now, much more so than ever before. Where previously the Glazers had no interest in selling, and also this should be noted as well. Usually, any reports that there was a potential sale or they were for sale were very quickly denied by the club, whereas that was not the case this time. I mean, I put it to the club last week and got a no comment.
No comment is always intriguing around about this time, especially when they potentially have to declare to the New York Stock Exchange if there is a viable bid for shares out of the club as well. Silence sometimes can be golden when there are people circling around trying to purchase. One of the purchases I want to ask you about before we finish up is Aubameyang, because Thomas Tuchel was pretty open after the game at the weekend against Leeds that they're blunt up front now that Lukaku has left and they don't have a whole lot of options up front. They are in pretty strongly, it would appear, to try and sign Aubameyang, but with a very high price tag, it would seem, at €30 million. Is this one we expect to get over the line in the next week?
Yeah, I think so, just because Chelsea, I mean, they've got issues of their own. Tuchel's made his own agitation clear, and they do need a finisher. I would expect it to be on, if not without a little bit of negotiation since. But I mean, in that context, it does make, I think, the pursuit of Anthony Gordon from Everton a little bit all the more odd. But I mean, he's, as we reported in the Independent today, my colleague Richard Jolly, Gordon has said he wants to go. I mean, Chelsea seem to have a huge budget this summer. I'm not sure how that would affect it, but yeah, I do think that the Aubameyang one looks very likely.
It is a late potential spending splurge from them if they were to go for Gordon, Fofana and Aubameyang over the next week. Considering the money they've already spent during this window too, they could well go north of £200 million here. Yeah.
And I mean, that's almost like something from the very first Abramovich days. And people expected that to be gone, but maybe I suppose there's a sense of maybe from the new ownership that it's also about a classic case of speculating to accumulate as well. They need to make a statement, need to show what the new Chelsea are about, and need a commercially viable team, which actually isn't, I suppose, ironically, at least in kind of commercial spirit, isn't too far from Barcelona. Although obviously the situation is different there.
Yeah, for sure. Well, look, 9 more days before the transfer window slams shut, as they say. Miguel, thanks a million as always.